In today's video, I'm going to show you 9 different ways of transferring your image to your paper. Welcome back to my channel. On this channel, we do drawing videos like this one, lots of watercolor content, also watercolor pencils, even some mixed media and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. It's completely free. And unlike many channels on YouTube, we are fully CAT approved. Now, I know transferring your image onto your paper, whether it's from real life or from a photograph, is something that many of you struggle with and you've asked for more help with. I've done other longer videos on things like the grid method. I'm going to cover that in this video. I'll also link those longer videos in the description of this video so that you can deep dive into those subjects if you want to. There's much chat online about tracing and should you trace? Is it wrong to trace? I like to look at all of these transfer methods as something that aids and helps my natural drawing abilities rather than replaces them. I have heard people say things like, well, I just trace everything. I'm not interested in learning to draw. I just like to paint, so I just trace the drawing. And although people shouldn't be shamed for doing this, I think it's really sad because anybody can learn to draw. And the thing to remember is that drawing and painting are not two separate areas. You can't just detach one from the other. Drawing teaches you manual dexterity. It teaches you mark making. Painting is really just drawing with a brush, and at some point you're going to need to be accurate with that, and drawing is going to help you with your painting or anything else that you're doing. Whether it's printmaking or embroidery or any creative task, drawing is going to help you. So we don't want to use these transfer methods to completely replace our drawing ability. So we're going to be looking at them this week from that angle, with the idea that these things give us a little bit of help when we need it, and that we can bring one or more of them into any of our drawings and paintings, not to mindlessly just photocopy an image onto our piece of paper, but to help us to get a better result. Now, the one thing I won't be covering in this video are methods such as camera obscura or projectors, because I don't use those. And we're going to look first at tracing, and any of my remarks about tracing, you can kind of transfer those remarks onto projectors as well, because they are both methods that give us the entire image placed directly onto the paper. As we go through these different methods, I'm going to look at the pros and the cons and tell you how I use them in my own work. So let's get started. So first we're going to look at good old-fashioned, cheap old tracing paper. So here I am with some traditional tracing paper, which I've placed over the top of a flower bud. Now we all know how to trace. I'll just go through the method briefly for you, but I want to talk more in this video about pros and cons. So to me, there are an awful lot of cons to using tracing paper. So let's look at the pros first of all. I mean, the good thing is that you get, an exact copy of what you want, and you're not going to have mistakes in shape or size or placement. But there are some downsides. One of the main ones, of course, is that you can't really scale this larger or smaller unless you actually, scale the photograph itself and then print that off. The image that you're tracing is going to be exactly the same size. There's also the possibility of damage being done to the photograph. If it's a decent photograph, you might not want it dented by having to press so hard as you trace. It's a little time consuming. And one of the main reasons I don't like tracing is it doesn't do anything to help you learn to draw. The more you learn to draw, drawing's like a muscle. The more you practice your drawing, the better you will get at it. And by tracing, we don't learn to draw at all. There are other methods that can give us a little bit of help, but still exercise our brain a bit too. Now, this is a time-consuming method because what I've got to do now is turn this over. And if I were just to draw on the back like this, well, that will work. But of course, it will be reversed, which may be quite important. So I'll put a piece of scrap paper under it instead. And now I have to go over it a second time. I'm using a soft pencil here because that will add a lot of graphite to the paper and allow it to be transferred. So I'm going over my drawing a second time. And it's only human nature, of course, that we don't take quite as much care second time around. So we can get a few inaccuracies. One of the main things I dislike about tracing is that it can lead to a really stilted image. If you're doing it for a painting, you can end up almost doing some kind of paint by numbers thing where you've got these shapes and you fill them in. It's just really easy with tracing to end up with a finished result that looks very, I want to say almost sanitized. It doesn't really have any artistic merit to it. That's not to say there isn't a time and a place for tracing. So having gone on the back, now we can turn over. So we're back to the rotation where we were before. And now you'll need a fairly hard pencil because you'll need to make sure that you're pressing hard enough so that you transfer that graphite over onto your drawing. This again can cause issues. It's not good to dent paper. Once you dent paper, it can be very hard to remove mistakes or things you want to change. It can also cause pencils and dry media to skip over the top, leaving a white gap. If you do it on watercolor paper and then you try painting, you can find that the watercolor sits in those dips. And again, you get marks that you might not want. So let's lift this up and have a look. And you can see we're starting to get rather a broken image, but it's certainly good enough to see where we're going. As I said, I'm not keen on tracing paper. It's time consuming. It gives a very stilted look and it's not going to improve my drawing at all. Now, if you do need to trace, I have something that actually works much better than tracing paper. Let's look now at Tracedown graphite paper. When I first started my journey as a fine artist, I did quite a bit of freelance illustration work. And the thing with illustration work is sometimes you don't get the luxury of drawing by eye. I would get a phone call on a Monday and they would say to me, we need 100 tiny little figures 2 inches high for this particular project we're doing. And we need them by Friday evening. You know, just assuming I had nothing else on, I had no choice but to trace because I still had all of the pen and all of the watercolor to apply. And of course, all the research to do and the images to find. So tracing it was, and I used to use this stuff. This is Tracedown paper. It has graphite on one side. It's a bit like that old-fashioned blue paper you used to get in typewriters years ago. If you're as old as me, you'll remember. It's like carbon paper, but it is graphite, so it's pencil. And what we do is we hinge our work like this and we place down, and then we can go straight on top. Now, again, you've got the problem that you may be damaging your photograph. This is just one that I printed off of my computer, so I'm not too worried. But you can see that if you had something a bit more valuable, you would need to reprint it. You've got all of the other downsides of tracing, but this method is actually much faster. If you use this stuff, it's really important to fix your picture down so that when you lift up, you can see what you've traced and what you haven't. So what are the specific downsides of Tracedown paper? Well, it's certainly faster than traditional tracing paper, but it can be very messy. Now, this is an old piece. I've used it time and time again, so it's behaving really nicely. But when it's brand new, it has an awful lot of graphite on, and you have only even just to lean on it, and you get sort of smudgy marks. Nevertheless, if I have to trace, I'll choose this over tracing paper every time. So far, we've been working on images of the same size, but it's very often the case that you need to go bigger or smaller. In other words, you need to scale the thing that you're looking at. Let me show you my easy method for scaling a photograph to make sure that the proportions of your paper are exactly the same, because unless the proportions are the same on your paper, none of the other methods, such as the grid method, are going to work. This is a really simple method, so let's get started. What I'm going to show you next is a method of scaling a photograph to any size. And I'm talking about the outside shape of the paper, not the image itself. So this is something that we're going to use in combination with some of the other methods I'm going to show you. So this is where you need your paper to be the exact proportions of your photograph, and you want it to be as large as possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to place this in the corner here. These are all cut square 90 degrees. If there's any slanting, it's just the angle of the camera. So we're going to tape that there. What I'm going to do now is draw a line from corner to corner. You can use a ruler, a set square, or even just a piece of paper, anything that's cut square. I'm going to take this line down here. Now, depending on the shape and size of your photograph, it will either come out of the bottom edge here, but it may also come out on the right over here. If you have a much different shaped photograph, it could come out of this edge here. What we're going to do then is take a right angle. Again, you just need a piece of square cut printer paper. You don't need a fancy set square. And we're going to take a line up there. So this means that this part here is the exact same proportions of my photograph. But of course, that's not really making the most of this, is it? So we could turn our paper around. Let's turn it over and do that. So let's try it again. This looks much more like the shape of the picture, doesn't it? Let's try it here. And again, I'm going to come out of this corner here. Just moved it up there so you can see. I've got the camera fairly low here because it gives you a better view. And again, I'm going to take a right angle up. What this tells me is that if I get rid of this area here by cutting it off or just taping it out of the way, I have an area to work in that is the exact same proportions as my photograph. One or two of you have asked me, but Michelle, what do I do if it's a canvas or, if I'm working on a set area, I can't just cut the edge off. All you need to do then is take the excess, divide it in half, put half on each side, or as I said, it may be top and bottom, and then you can just continue the background a little bit wider. It may be, however, that the excess, you want to keep it all in one side. For instance, you've got too much sky or too much foreground, you can put it all on one side. It's just a way of showing you which area of your paper or canvas is proportionally the same as your photograph, because there are lots of methods of transferring your picture onto your paper, which we're going to talk about next, that simply won't work if you're not on the same proportion paper. Doesn't matter if it's larger or smaller, but it must have the same proportions. Next, let's look at the grid method. So let's talk about the grid method. Now, this is a really excellent method of transferring an image across. I like it much better than standard tracing because it does make you have to work a little bit. You still have to do some drawing by eye, which is really going to help to teach your brain how to draw. So the basic principle is you have a photograph and you're going to put a grid of squares across it. You can draw directly onto the photograph if it's not important to you, or you can put it on, I've got it on tracing paper. If you want to do this very often, then something like some clear acetate would be better. And you place your grid of squares across, and then on your paper where you're working, you have larger squares. Obviously, I'm not doing the full thing here. And you start to look, here we are in the right-hand corner, and we've got one full square where there's nothing in, and then our little mushroom starts to come down here. Let me swap to a darker pencil, and I can see it comes around here, and I can start to replicate that shape. Now, what are the pros and cons of this method? And by the way, if you want to see a much more in-depth video all about the grid method, I have that one and I'll link it in the video description. But what are the pros and cons of this method? Well, as I said, one of the good things about it is it's going to help you to get things in the right place, but it's also going to help to train your brain. There is some maths to be done. You're going to have to look at how many squares across you can fit and then work out how many squares across would fit on your paper. Do a bit of maths. It's important that they are square, not oblong, or you can distort the image. One of the main downsides with this is if you're working in a medium that's quite sensitive, like drawing or watercolor, where you can't really have a load of square marks left behind, it can be difficult to get the grid off of your paper. You have to press very lightly indeed. If you're doing something like acrylics, no problem at all. You can just cover up these marks. But it is time consuming and it can be hard to get those grid marks off. One thing that I find grids really useful for is if you're drawing on a surface that's in, say, a different rotation to how you would normally draw. For instance, when I learned to draw, I was always using flat methods. I've done traditional printmaking, I've done watercolors. None of these things are done on an easel. I've also done mosaics. They need to be done flat. I'm really good at drawing on a flat surface. I find it much easier than drawing on an easel. However, many people learn to draw on easels and then find it difficult to draw on a flat surface. And it may sometimes be necessary. I've used the grid technique to transfer a mural onto a wall. You could use a grid method to transfer an easel drawing onto a flat surface like a table. And anywhere that you need to scale up just so large, it was very alien to me to draw on an upright surface. And so when I wanted to make a mural on my daughter's bedroom wall when she was small, I took my drawing and I used the grid method to translate it onto the wall. And it worked very well indeed. For simpler subjects, we don't always need a full grid. Let's look at some easier ways of using grids. So if the grid method is very time consuming, is there a quicker way of doing it? Yes, there is. We can do a much simpler grid. One thing I've seen some students do is just to fold their reference photograph in quarters. So they've got fold lines here and here. Used to get quite fed up when people did it in my art classes with my photographs actually, because they were all bent up then for the next class. But that's something that you can do. I've also got a full tutorial on this channel where you can make a grid just by taking a line corner to corner. I'm doing this on tracing paper here just to preserve my photograph. This method is one where it is vital that you have checked that your photograph is the same rotation as your piece of paper before starting. Because if you use this method on a photograph and then your piece of paper is different proportions, it's a little bit more oblong, what will happen is you'll distort and stretch the image. It will warp. But providing you've got the same proportions of paper, this is a really simple grid method. You can see straight away, I can find the center point here. I can see where this petal comes to. I've got some diagonals to follow here. It's just going to give me a little bit of help. I'll leave a link to the full tutorial for this method in the description of this video. Next, let's look at scale divider tools, and I'll tell you why I always wanted to confiscate them from people who came in to my art classes. So let's talk about the absolute bane of my life, scale dividers, and why I've had such a bad experience with these. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with the scale divider. Let me explain to you how it works. This is a fairly cheap one. And so it hasn't really got any markings on, but basically you move this clip up and down and you'll get different proportions. In other words, you open this and you measure something, and then at the other end it will be wider. It will have made it proportionally bigger, and whatever you measure within that same clip is going to make the thing bigger. So in other words, we could measure the height of the mushroom and then we hold it still, turn it over, and we have enlarged the height of the mushroom. So what's wrong with these? In my opinion, pretty much everything. What's wrong with these is people move them, and people refuse to believe that they have moved them. So many times I would walk around my art class and I would come across a drawing of a cat with a neck as long as a giraffe, or a gap between a nose and a mouth that you could fit a sleeping kitten in. Something that was just so obviously wrong. And yet for the student that used the scale dividers, these were infallible. They could not be wrong. They could not have got it wrong. And yet I could see, just using common sense, that something had gone wrong somewhere. There is another problem with scale dividers, and that is that they're very bad at actually placing an object in the right place. So by all means use them if you want to, in combination with other methods. Get the items placed first of all on your paper and then set your scale dividers, but always use common sense. So I'm going to read for you a very, very short quote. It's from the book 1984, and I read this actually, I'm so old, I read 1984 before 1984. And the quote is this: "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." That's a very famous quote, isn't it? Now, drawing has nothing to do with politics or horrific regimes, but scale dividers like this can persuade you to reject the evidence of your own eyes. If it doesn't look right, it isn't right, whether you're using this or the grid method. I've done that wrong as well before now. I've accidentally measured one set of squares a little bit wrong. Always with any of these methods, use your common sense. Step away from it for a few minutes and ask yourself if it actually looks right. I personally don't like these at all. I haven't found a single person that's able to use them without accidentally moving them as they turn them over. Let's look at a really good way of getting the shape of an object or a person. This is called the envelope technique. I have done a longer video on this technique. If you're interested in that, you can watch that after this video, but I'll cover it briefly here. It's really useful. Let's look at a technique I like much better. Now, this again is not a good technique for placing things on your paper. It's a great technique for getting the shape of something when something's in a real strange position. It's fantastic for people and animals, particularly when things have been strangely foreshortened and you just can't figure out what shape they're meant to be. I also love it for florals. It's fantastic for flower heads that are facing in different directions. It's called the envelope technique, and I've done a whole video on it. It's probably my maybe top 3 videos. It's one of my most popular videos. And what you do basically is you take a shape and you imagine that you have encased it in an envelope. In other words, a straight-sided shape, whether that be a triangle, a square, a hexagon. You're going to join up like this. So this is for drawing by eye, but it's going to give you a really good idea of the shape of things. So I've got my chap here. We can look at the angle of him. We can think about how he sits. We can start thinking about if that foot is higher than the hand, it is a little bit. And what it's going to do is it's going to give us a starting point to draw this chap. Now, obviously, a lot more work to be done on him, but you can start to see how useful this is as a technique for getting really odd shapes. It's great for flowers too. Look at all these daisies facing in different directions. I can start by getting that outside shape, finding a center point, and instantly I can start to draw my flower facing in any direction. As I said, it's not great for initial placement, but it's fantastic for getting weirdly shaped people, flowers, objects, especially things that are turned and foreshortened. It's a wonderful way of training your brain to see how something actually is. Let's look now at using your pencil as a measuring tool. I'm going to show you how we can do this when we're working from photographs to check angles. We'll also talk about what people are doing when they're doing all of this business. So before we point the camera downwards, I'm going to show you how you use your arm outstretched and your pencil to measure. If you haven't done this before, it's quite a difficult thing to film. I'm going to use my picture at the back here to show you. Now, the thing to remember about this method is that you must keep your arm completely straight, because if you are measuring like this and your elbow is bent, going in and out, you're not measuring anything at all. So you must have your elbow straight, your arm straight. So this is what you would do when you are measuring something in a landscape. So say it's a house and you want to measure, what you're measuring here is proportions. You're not actually measuring inches or centimeters or anything like that. You're trying to see, is the house perhaps 1/3 high and 2/3 across? Do the windows come more than halfway down? Something like that. So what you'll do is you'll use the top of your pencil as one point. Now, I'm not going to fully straighten my arm here. It's just because if I step that far back, it'll mess up the audio. So you'll just have to imagine my arm is completely straight out in front of me. And what you can do is you're going to take the pencil and you're going to put it against something like the top of this picture. And then you're going to slide your thumb down, and here you have a measurement. What you can do now is, again, with your arm straight, is you turn it sideways. I'm trying to twist my arm here. There we go. It's like doing your hair in the mirror. It's kind of backwards. And now I can check the width of my picture. Look at that, it's almost the same. Now, of course, the picture is not actually a square picture, it's a landscape picture. But because the camera's at an angle and we've got foreshortening, it's measuring almost exactly the same in height as it is in width. You can also use this to check angles. I could check, for instance, the angle from, let's say my little wooden sword there. It's actually quite a big wooden sword. And we could check the angle here. Now, again, you'd have to try and sort of almost remember this angle as you bring it across and down to your paper. Much easier to do when you're measuring from a photograph than measuring an angle in a landscape. But nevertheless, the brain can play tricks on us and it can flip angles around the wrong way. So sometimes just placing a straight edge along an angle really can help you to see how it is and where it lines up with something else. We can also use this when we're working from a photograph. I'll show you that next. So let's use the edge of our pencil to actually work out angles. Now, the thing about angles is they remain the same no matter the scale. So whatever angle this is, if you would measure it, I have literally no idea, 38 degrees, 56 degrees, whatever it is, if I drew it on a wall 4 foot high, the angle would remain the same. Therefore, no matter how big or small we're working, we can use our pencil to measure an angle. Now, the cons to this are, of course, that it's a little bit inaccurate. It's easy to move things. So one of the things you have to do is make sure that you are not twisting your paper. Some people end up when they're drawing twisting their paper around, or they twist the photograph. So what you want to do is place your photograph as near to where you're working as possible and put it against an edge. It doesn't matter if it's top, side, bottom, just so that you know that you're not twisting. Because if I want to measure the angle of this little pyramid here, for example, if I do this, it's no help at all. So I'm going to place this here like this, and then I can roughly check the angle, move this across, and I sometimes just kind of place my fingers there like so in order to get that angle. We can do the same again with the other side. As I said, it's not exact, but it certainly gives you a very good idea, probably much closer than doing it by eye. And there aren't aren't just precise angles like this, like you see on the side of a building. There are actually always angles between things, and those angles between things also stay the same. So if we go back to Surfer Dude here, and we can look at the foot and the hand here, and we see that the foot, when we look at it compared to this edge here, the foot is higher than the hand. So if I was drawing him, I can bring that along here. I can also use it to measure between items. So if we look at the top of the small pyramid to the top of the big pyramid, again, we have an angle. Now, if I've already drawn the big pyramid on my paper and I check this angle and mine's different, then I know that something has gone wrong here. So using your pencil is going to help you to see an angle. It's going to help you to check if that angle's correct, and it's going to help to check between one object and another, and it's going to aid in your placement. You can combine this with things like the simplified grid method I showed you to double check that you're getting things right. Let's talk now about just drawing by eye and how I use the edge of the paper as a reference point. Let's look at another method that I use probably more than any other method, because I usually draw by eye, but I want to check I've got things in the right place. Now again, you need to use that earlier method of making sure your paper proportions are correct. In this case, actually, because I want to keep it small to work on camera, this piece of paper is actually the same size as my photo, so I haven't got to worry. But if this piece of paper were 4 times bigger than my photograph, this method can still be used. Now, we spoke about angles staying the same, proportions stay the same too. So what does that mean? It means that I can go along the side of my paper here and I can look at this image and I can think to myself, where is the halfway point? And maybe it's here, and I can then mark the halfway point on my paper. Again, this is the same size paper, but this will work if you're on much larger paper. So I know that this start of this sand dune here is lower than halfway. If I really want to be, really precise about it, I could even measure and I could find the halfway point. I don't usually do that, but you can do that. And then I want to come down a little bit. So of the half of that photograph, maybe this sand dune comes 2/3 of the way up. So again, I can put a little mark here. And what I'm looking at here is the edges. I'm looking at the things in the photograph in relation to the edges and the outside of that photograph. So I want to find the main elements. So I'm going to start really with this horizon line. I want to think, is this side here higher or lower than this? We can check. We can either use a set square. More often than not, I just grab a piece of paper. I'm going to line this up here. It's a little bit small, but I can come across here and I can see that the edge of the sand dune actually is pretty much, it goes up and down, but it pretty much stays the same, more or less all the way across. Let's look at placing the pyramids now. Let's think about this point of this pyramid here. If I was to take a line straight up, and again, I'll use a piece of paper or my pencil and think to myself, how far across does it come? It's less than halfway. So halfway would be about here. So it's slightly over to the left. So again, I can find the center of my paper and then think, well, it's a little bit further over. So we can pop it here. Let's look at now how much of this sky area it takes up. We've already decided where the horizon line is, or rather the sand dune line is, and it probably comes 2/3 of the way up. So I can go back here. I've got a mark for the tip of it. I can go 2/3 of the way up. I can place this here. Now's where I'll start to combine with my angles method. And we also can see that the bottom of it comes almost all the way across. So we can just sort of check that. And here we are. I can place my finger there and I'm starting to get my pyramids drawn. In this simple way, no matter how big or small my paper is, I can look at proportions and angles and place things in. What this stops from happening is your brain playing tricks on you. You may look at an object and you may know that this is a very large object, but in your picture, it may actually be fairly small. You may look at a small object you know in your mind to be small, and yet it may take up the whole area of your painting or your drawing. And so our brain will play tricks on us. This is why when people draw houses, they always make them too big, because they can't get over the idea in their head that this is a big object, even if that house is in reality tiny on the paper. For me, this is the simplest and the most useful of my techniques is just to look at the objects on the paper and relate them to the outside edge. Don't forget to let me know in the comments what you found helpful about this video. Of course, if you have any questions or any suggestions for other similar videos that you might like to see me make here on YouTube. And before you leave the video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. You'll find details of my full drawing course down there. You can also grab some free stuff. I've got some free downloadable PDFs. I've even got a free painting course that you can take for no money whatsoever. Lots of other good free stuff down there too. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you're going to enjoy one of my most popular drawing videos. You can watch that one right now.